I recently had the great honor of sitting down with the one and only President Donald Trump. And as always, it was an incredibly insightful and absolutely fascinating conversation that stretched on for hours, giving us a deep dive into his experience as a non-politician who upended the system and took on the machine that controls Washington, D.C. I opened the conversation by bringing up something truly remarkable, something that I wish we could have played for the audience, but we decided against it because in this modern era, even a simple clip can get you copyright struck and allow them a way to take an entire episode down, which we absolutely couldn't risk. The clip in question was from his appearance on The View back in 2015. Right when he was first running for president, I reminded him how he was introduced on that show, not as a political adversary, not as a divisive figure, but as, and I quote, our friend Donald Trump. He quickly confirmed that memory. That's right, he told me. It's hard to believe now, but he was telling me how Whoopi Goldberg gave him a big hug and a kiss. Joy Behar gave him a big hug, and even the late, great Barbara Walters gave him a big hug. All of them, absolutely everyone on that stage, loved him. They were talking about him in such a favorable light, discussing how he might be conservative in his financial positions, but that he was socially very liberal. The audience, I recall, was cheering for him. It was a moment of complete harmony, a truly bizarre, almost alternative universe when you look at how things are today. But that's when things changed, and we talked about the moment the switch flipped. It happened, he said, when he actually started winning in the polls. That's when the machine started working against him, and he told me that there has probably been no one in history who has been attacked in such a coordinated and systematic way as he has been. The coordinated nature of this attack is what I think is so shocking and what a lot of people are catching on to now. I brought up another example. Oprah Har, whom he had been on many times, and even on one of her final shows. On that last show, he had been encouraged by her, and he reflected on how far we've come since those days. He noted that the moment the world turned on him was the precise moment they realized he was going to be the president. He emphasized that the coordination was very obvious, and he told me that highly intelligent, longtime Democrats like Elon Musk and Bill Ackman are now catching on to this and actually supporting him. Bill Ackman, he mentioned, has been very supportive. This transition led us to talk about the concept of two different lives. He talked about how he had a very successful and wonderful life before politics. His show, The Apprentice, Gers, was still going strong, having run for 14 seasons over 12 years. He clarified that the show wasn't canceled because he was running. He was ready to move on. He mentioned that they had tried to talk him out of running. Mark Burnett, a great guy, wanted to extend the contract and told him he was crazy to run, saying, "Nobody gives up prime time." The heads of NBC came over, all the top people, to try and talk him out of it because The Apprentice was a hot show and doing so well. He then explained the genesis of his run, detailing how a poll done 3 or 4 years before, which included him alongside Mitt Romney, showed him blowing everybody away. He said with a laugh that beating Mitt Romney isn't that hard, frankly, but those good poll numbers made him think seriously about running. Though he was tied up with his contract and building 2 big luxury buildings, he wanted to make sure those buildings were finished properly and that his very capable kids were fully involved. Once those successes were finished, he thought about running for the next cycle after what he termed the Romney disaster, and he ran and he won against Hillary, which he called quite an experience. I then asked him the critical question: what was it really like when he got in? Not the campaign, but the actual moment of taking office, because no one can truly prepare you for that. He told me it was very surreal. He compared it to another intense moment in his life, getting shot, which he said was not surreal. When he was laying on the ground, he knew exactly what was going on, where he was hit, and he was completely clear-headed. He explained that his ear was torn up, which bleeds a lot, and he remembered thinking clearly that he wasn't hit anywhere else, but the presidency, he stressed, was a very surreal experience. He walked me through that day one experience, from winning to the inauguration. He recounted driving down Pennsylvania Avenue, passing his hotel and seeing an unbelievable sight, more motorcycles, police, and military than he had ever seen. He described the spectacle of his first time using Air Force One and the beautiful drive down the avenue in the opposite direction of normal traffic. He told me the love was so crazy that he wanted to get out and wave, a dangerous thing to do when you remember what happened to Kennedy and others, but he felt it was important to do. So he and Melania got out for a very short walk, and she was in a beautiful dress which became a staple that people loved. The moment that really stuck with him was getting to the White House. He went up to the presidential quarters and was standing in this beautiful hallway. He pointed out that people never talk about how beautiful the White House is inside. They expect it to be all metal doors, but it's magnificent. As someone who made his money largely on luxury, he was impressed. The hallway was 25 feet wide. The ceiling heights were perfect, and the whole place was stunning. Then he had to see the Lincoln bedroom. He had heard about it, but had never seen it. Standing there with his wife, looking at the bed, it was amazing, a hallowed moment. He pointed out that Lincoln was very tall, 6 feet 6 inches, which would be like his son Barron, who is 6 feet 9 inches, and so the bed was elongated for him. What really struck him was the history in that room. Right there under glass was the original version of the Gettysburg Address. Looking around, he said, "Do you believe this?" Because he was never a politician, he just sort of started right, and all of a sudden he was standing in the White House. The room, he confessed, was so beautiful to him, much more beautiful than it actually is to a casual observer, because of the history and the moment. He then got into the sad history of Lincoln, mentioning how the president and his wife suffered from melancholia, what we now call depression. On top of that, they lost their son, Tad. He described seeing a little picture of Tad in the room and how devastating that loss was. He also shared a fascinating piece of White House history he learned from people who really know the place. Lincoln had the yips, as a golfer would say, about Robert E. Lee. Lee had won about 13 battles in a row, and Lincoln was genuinely phobic about beating him. He recounted being at a UFC fight where a champion who was 14 and one lost a second time to the only guy who had ever beaten him, illustrating the psychological advantage that one fighter had over the other, just like Lee had over Lincoln. He told me that even the great real generals, the ones who defeated ISIS in a matter of weeks and are not woke television generals, consider Robert E. Lee a genius in strategy. He explained how Lee took a war that should have been over in a few days and turned it into years of vicious hell. This whole entry into the presidency, he repeated, was surreal. He hadn't run for office before. He just ran for a number of months and won. He described going into the debates with 18 other people, mostly professional politicians, and slowly knocking them out one by one. But the most defining aspect of his time there, once the surreal nature wore off and it became his place to stay, was that his focus became two things: governing the country and survival. He explained that from the moment he won, even before he got to the office, the attacks started. He saw an early report in the Washington Post that stated, "Now the impeachment stuff starts," and it literally did from the beginning. So he had a combination that most presidents do not face: governing the nation and survival. I asked him about his ability to govern, since he was new to it, never having been a governor or a mayor, but only a private businessman. This is where the sheer scope of the job became apparent. He told me he had to make approximately 10,000 appointments. While some are big ones, like Secretary of State, who then appoints many others, the president is ultimately involved with about 10,000 total. The challenge, he admitted, was knowing who to appoint, since he had virtually no Washington experience. He told me he was only in Washington about 17 times over the years and never stayed over. He was a New York guy, a New York builder, who knew that world, but not Washington. He lamented the current state of Washington, calling it a very dangerous and badly maintained place that he intends to fix and make great again. He was always involved in politics, but mostly as a big donor to both Democrats and Republicans, showing me pictures of himself with a very young Ronald Reagan. He told me he was a Democrat until the early 90s, when he switched over. He confirmed that while he likes RFK Jr., he realized that being an independent or a third party is simply nonsense. because the U.S. is a two-party system. He explained that even if you win, you won't get half of Congress to vote for you, and a third-party candidate will just get eaten alive by the system. He went on to give the historical context. 92% of all presidents were politicians, and 8% were generals like Eisenhower or Washington. There had never been a businessman or someone who hadn't been elected to an office before, like him. This inexperience, he explained, was why he had to rely on people that he respected or liked, but that he didn't know that well. He said he even had to rely on people he had campaigned against, some of whom he came to like and others he still doesn't like. This led to a digression about how everyone, despite what they say publicly, wants one of these positions. They die for it and are often begging for it. He mentioned a very rich, successful guy in New York who would give anything to be Secretary of State, but would pretend he wasn't interested if asked publicly. He then brought up a major problem with the appointment process. It's very dangerous to pick somebody outside of politics because a politician has been vetted for years. When you pick a business guy, they've never been checked up on, and you know nothing about their personal life, which can lead to problems later. So he felt stuck. You have to pick established people, but the established people are indoctrinated into the system and are often stiffs. So I asked him what he meant by stiffs, and he explained they are survivors who never do anything controversial or take any chances. They don't speak their opinion outside of the accepted narrative. He gave an example of a congressman he was close to for many years who wouldn't help him get a controversial license, simply because the congressman was a survivor who wanted to make it through his 28 years in Congress. He surprisingly said he didn't even disrespect the guy for it. He respected the guy more because he was a survivor. He summed it up by saying it's a good way for non-exceptional people to survive. I then asked him for the one big mistake he would admit to after his successful presidency, which included a great economy, rebuilding the military, the biggest tax cuts in history, and appointing 3 Supreme Court justices. He gave the same answer he always does. The biggest mistake was the people he picked. He picked some great people, but he picked a few he shouldn't have. He specified that these were neocons or disloyal or just bad people. He gave examples calling John Kelly a bully but a weak person. He also called John Bolton an idiot. He told me a story about a very rich and smart friend from Las Vegas, Count Phil Ruffin, who called him up to say, don't pick him after he had already hired Bolton, saying Bolton was a bad guy. But Bolton, despite being a nut jobby, was good in a certain way. Trump explained that every time he had to deal with a country, they would see this whack job standing behind him and think, oh man, Trump's going to go to war with him. All right? Bolton was, of course, with Bush when they went into the Middle East stupidly, which Trump had criticized even as a civilian. This brought us to the media. I told him that the reason he always got more publicity than other people, which he asked me about, was that he said a lot of wild things. CNN and all their brilliance would highlight the wild things, which made him much more popular and boosted him in the polls. I explained that people were tired of the pre-prepared politician lingo, and even if they didn't agree with him, they knew that whoever that guy was, that was really him. I talked about how certain people in the public eye have these pre-planned answers, and everything is so rehearsed that you never get to the meat of it. The beautiful thing about him, I argued, is that he freeballs. He gets out at these huge events and he's just talking. I brought up how we've highlighted his comedic instincts on the show, like his impression of Biden walking around not knowing what he's doing, or his impression of Elon Musk. It's funny stuff like stand-up. And I mentioned his great timing, like when he told Hillary, you'd be in jail. This kind of comedy was unheard of for a politician. He took that point and ran with it, saying you need at least the attitude of a comedian, leader pies in this business, which he called a very dangerous business. He corrected me, saying it's the most dangerous business. Right up there with going to war, being a firefighter, or a cop. Being president is the most dangerous, especially for him. I reminded him that he hasn't even gotten to the general election yet, and there have already been 2 assassination attempts on him, which were brushed out of the news like it was nothing. I contrasted this, saying, imagine if there was assassination attempts on Biden. the media would have never stopped talking about it. They would be attacking the right, ramping up gun laws, and trying to blame him. If Biden got shot in the ear, we would have never heard the end of it. He agreed that this attention comes from being a consequential president. So he said he does things that don't necessarily make him popular, but he does what's right. He is for having countries pay us trillions of dollars, mentioning that he took in hundreds of billions from China when no other president took in 10 cents. He then gave a stunning example of his foreign policy. He connected Iran's broken economy to the fact that they wouldn't have had money for Hezbollah or Hamas, and that the attack on Israel would have never happened. He explained that he told China that if they bought a single barrel of oil from Iran, they couldn't do business in the United States, which made Iran broke. He understands that by doing this, he makes himself a target, and it is a very dangerous business. We looked at the statistics of danger. He said he saw a statistic that 0.1% of race car drivers die. He then brought up bull riding, saying those guys are worse than UFC fighters, talking about those monster bulls and seeing the slow motion footage of a foot nearly hitting a rider's head. He agreed that about 0.1% of bull riders die and get hurt badly. But he noted, when you look at the amount of assassinations and attempts on a president, it is statistically a very dangerous position, though he admitted he never thought about that when he decided to run. I joked that he probably just assumed people loved him from The Apprentice and would love him as president. The conversation inevitably came back to the media attacks, and I brought up how they constantly try to take things out of context and distort them, even making things up entirely. I mentioned how they would take his comment about Robert E. Lee and say, Donald Trump wishes the South won. He loves Robert E. Lee. We then circled back to The View and the level of sheer fabrication that goes into the media. He went into more detail on Joy Behar, telling me that she would see him in the theater or elsewhere and beg him to come back on the show, saying, "We have to. She loved you." I reemphasized that people need to watch that 2015 episode to see the alternative universe it represents. He then brought up a person who worked in his administration as an assistant press secretary who is now a host on The View on the far right side. He told me that when she left his administration, she wrote him a gorgeous letter calling him the greatest president, but when she went to The View, she started hitting the hell out of him because they won't hire you unless you are negative. He said he's had many people tell him they have to go negative about him to get a good job at a place like CNN, so he just tells his friends to go ahead and make the money. He was clear. It's so crooked, the press is so crooked. But then he talked about the worst thing he had ever seen, something that I believe is the biggest scandal in broadcast history. He brought up Kamala Harris's appearance on May's Just 60 Minutes. She gave an answer that he said a child wouldn't give. It was so bad. 60 Minutes. Then took the answer out and put in another one. They edited it so deceptively he called this not just editing, but fraud. He stressed that this wasn't just cutting a few words. They took a whole answer out and put another one in. He noted that she was essentially shown to be incompetent. This happened because an initial preview of the segment was released with the full original bad answer, but then the bosses realized they had a problem and changed it. He called this election interference and fraud, and a huge deal since 60 Minutes is the head of CBS's news division, and they shouldn't be engaging in this kind of corruption. We also discussed how the suppression of the Hunter Biden laptop story was another huge example of election interference that he believes made a 10-point difference. In the election, he noted that he lost by 1/10 of a point, or 22,000 votes, so the suppression of this massive story was a critical factor. I brought up a favorite of mine, J.D. Vance, whom I think is a brilliant guy with an ability to talk like a normal human being, and how he did great on my friend Theo Vaughn's podcast. Trump agreed, saying, I like him a lot. This conversation about election interference also included a long discussion about how the Democrats, including Hillary Clinton and her supporters, have a history of denying election results Even after she conceded to him on election night, he pointed out that many sad sacks in Congress who are Democrats are still denying the 2016 election. He then brought up what he considers a major example of manipulation, the debate rules. He described how they had wanted no crowd, no time constraint on questions, and the ability to cut off the microphone. I told him that I think they didn't want a crowd because he is so good at working one. He agreed, saying he believes they structured the rules to make him reject the debate offer. They came to him and gave him a deal he couldn't refuse, like the mob, and he took it. The only thing he asked for was to stand up, as he thought it looked bad to sit down, and they agreed, even though he gets tired, referring to Biden. I also recalled how he had smartly decided not to participate in the Republican primary debates when he was leading by 74 points, correctly deducing that the other candidates would just kill themselves trying to focus on him. He also wanted to talk about some of the incredibly wasteful government spending. He brought up the $42 billion spent on an internet access program in the United States that hasn't hooked up one person yet. He pointed out that with that kind of money, they could have gotten Starlink satellite internet to everybody for almost nothing. He also mentioned the billions spent on our EV charger stations, noting that they only built 8 of them in the Midwest, which is basically 9 gas pumps that cost $1 billion. We shifted to his administration's accomplishments, where I asked him to compare the importance of his tax cuts versus his regulation cuts to business people. He was very clear. Every one of them said the regulation cuts meant more. He noted that people wouldn't think that, but the regulation cuts actually equated to more dollars for them. He reminded me of a conversation he had with 2 pollsters who told him that if George Washington, we came back with Abraham Lincoln as his vice president, instead of the bad Mike Pence, whom he was referring to as Waltz, they couldn't beat him. We talked about foreign policy again, and he gave a great example of his art of the deal approach, recalling how he handled the president of France, Emmanuel Macron. Macron was planning to tax American companies, and Trump sent his smartest guys, including Steve Mnuchin, and they all failed to stop it. So Trump said he did it himself. He called Macron and told him, Emmanuel, you're taxing American companies. We're not going to allow you to do that. When Macron said he couldn't do anything because it had already been passed, Trump threatened to put a 100% tariff on French wines and champagnes and coming into the United States. Macron immediately dropped the whole thing within about 2 minutes. A massive amount of money, he stressed that he has to protect American companies. He emphasized the military again, pointing out that he rebuilt it, including our nuclear arsenal. He hated to redo the nuclear part, but realized how powerful it is, saying one bomb could take out the entire East Coast. He contrasted this terrifying reality with poor fools talking about oceans rising 1/8 of an inch over the next 500 years. Finally, we ended by talking about the grueling nature of the campaign. He mentioned that his opponent had taken days off, but he had gone 56 days in a row without a day off. And he wasn't going to take one because this is too exciting, more exciting than golf, even it's the home stretch, and he's going to keep making speeches. It was a phenomenal 3-hour conversation with the president, covering everything from the deeply personal reflections of standing in the Lincoln bedroom to the strategic necessity of appointing a whack job like John Bolton to the corruption of the news media. He ended the conversation on a gracious note, and I thanked him for his time and for giving us such a truly open and unfiltered look at his life as the 45th President of the United States.